Okay, today we are in John 11. Now, as we start out in John 11, it's a pretty simple chapter. It's a chapter talking about the raising of Lazarus, the whole chapter is. But let's remember where we left Jesus last week. Remember that he had healed that blind man, and Jerusalem was in chaos. They were in an uproar. The people, some of them believed in him, some of them didn't. And finally, the high priest, the people in the ruling situation, determined we have to catch him and we have to kill him. So they made that observation. Now Jesus then gave them the ultimatum. He said, "If I do not the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do them," then he goes ahead and he lays that ultimatum down. And with that ultimatum, why, he is getting ready to depart. Now the Pharisees' decision was this: and they sought again to take him, and he went forth out of their hand. So now the scene is set that they are getting ready to put Jesus to death. Jesus leaves Jerusalem in our last chapter, and we said he went beyond the Jordan. If we look at Jerusalem right there in the yellow, he went down about 20 miles until he turned to the north and went up there another 5 or 10 miles, and that's where he is right now. So he's going to be there until he gets the news from Lazarus, and then he will be making his way back up into the Jerusalem area. But that's where he is now as chapter 11 opens today. So keep in mind, what we're going to be talking about is something that happened between the Feast of Dedication, December, and the Passover, which would be in April. So he goes down there, and while he's down there, then he gets this message, that they send a message saying that Lazarus has died. Now, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and his sister and so forth. They came down and they said, Lazarus is sick. And when Jesus heard it, he said, now this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now this is an interesting thing, that Jesus now is actually saying the same thing that he said about that blind man. You remember when they asked him, who sinned? Was it his parents or did he sin? What caused him to be blind? And Jesus said, neither one, but his blindness is for the glory of God. That is, that I'm going to heal him and God is going to get the glory. Now here's a man who died. And he said, now this is going to be for the purpose of the Son of God being glorified through it. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is the reason why we need to keep in mind the situation back in Jerusalem. How that back in Jerusalem, it is at a fervor temper. That is, the people back there, the enemies, are so mad, they're so angry, they've given orders, let us know, we're going to kill him. People back there are talking about it, and now Jesus is getting ready to do something that's going to add to all of this. From your point and my viewpoint, it should solve the problem. But what's going to happen is it's going to really add to the problem. Now, it said Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Isn't that interesting? Instead of just running over there and healing him, no, he stayed right there. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. So now after 2 days, okay, let us go up. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? In other words, you know what will happen if you go up to Jerusalem. They are already set to stone you. Now here's Jesus' reaction to Lazarus' death. He said, are there not 12 hours in the day? And then he goes ahead and he says, now you must work while it's day, or before the night comes, or when the night comes, you're going to be stumbling around and not able to see to do that. So you got to work during the day. What this means is, well, that is true. You have to work during the day. But you say, what does that have to do with Jesus working? Why does he need to go now? Well, Jesus has a certain timetable he's working on. He knows he's going to be put to death at the next Passover. And he says, now, we all know that you must work during the daylight hours, or when the night comes, you're going to stumble and you can't work. Jesus has a certain period of time allotted to him to do his work, and he must accomplish it. What he's saying is, I must accomplish my work before the night hours come, before it's all over, is really what he's saying. Now, it's interesting, he said, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Now, Jesus is taunting them. He's setting them up. They then looked at him and they said, well, if he sleeps, then he'll get well again. Why are you going up just to wake him up? However, Jesus spoke of his death. Death is oftentimes in the Bible and in our culture, all other cultures, referred to as a sleep, that a person goes to sleep. It's a very kind way of talking about a person dying. You walk in a bedroom, you see somebody on the bed, you don't know whether they're asleep or whether they're dead, because the physical body is the same situation in both cases, except you know that if he's asleep, his organs are still working and you can wake him up. But it looks the same. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So now then he tells them, without any shadow of a doubt, Lazarus is dead. Now he tells them now why he's staying there. He said, I am glad for your sake that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let's go to him. Now, he has stayed there for 2 more days for a purpose. He said, now I am glad that I was down here, not up there, but I'm glad that I was down here when Lazarus died, because this is getting ready to help you, that you might believe. In other words, what you're getting ready to see me do is going to enable you to believe that I am the Christ. He said in there, then Thomas, he doesn't catch the connection, but he's called the twin. Now this is the same Thomas that doubted a little bit later on. He said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Well, if he's going to go, it's certain death, the disciples know, because the uproar is in Jerusalem. So let's go, and we'll all die with him. Now, Jesus gets up there. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now that's significant because funerals over there and burials are not like they are here. We take the body to a mortuary, they embalm it, and they then able to put the chemicals in that preserves the body, slows down the decay, so that you can keep it for months, really. But over in that hot climate, they did then, they still do today, bury a person the same day they die. Because when they die, the flesh begins to decay and it begins to smell. And so they want to get rid of the body just as quickly as they possibly can. Now think what would happen to a body if it was there and been in that hot climate for 4 days. This is a big deal. See? It's a big deal that you and I don't really appreciate because we wait a while before we go to a funeral. But he found that they'd been there for 4 days. Now it said, now Bethany was near Jerusalem. That's significant, about 2 miles away. Actually, they measure it out. It's about 1 mile and 7/8 is what I read. If you're standing on the Temple Mount where these leaders would be, You look over to that mount, Mount Olives, of which we've shown pictures before. You look at that mount, you go right over the mount, just about a half mile, 3/4 of a mile, there is that town of Bethany. So the town of Bethany is over just on that mount, less than 2 miles away from where these enemies of Jesus are now located. So he's coming back in to the surrounding area. 20. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatsoever you ask of God, he will give you. So, Lord, I know you would have healed him had you been here before he died. And I still believe that God will give you anything that you ask. Well, Jesus put her to the test. He said, your brother will rise again. Now you might think, well, she says, okay, let's go raise him. But no. She said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. So she doesn't expect any raising of the dead. She said, I know that God will hear you. She still has that faith, but it's not the deep kind of faith that believes that Jesus can do anything he wants to do and that he will do it. She says this, but she doesn't expect him to raise from the dead. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, he shall live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Now that's kind of, well, how would you put it? That's some question. That's some statement. I wonder what I would have said had I been there. Yes, Jesus is the resurrection and the life, but how is it that if you die, you're alive, and in fact, if you believe in Jesus, you'll never die, but when you do die, you'll be alive? How can that happen? See, that's what he's telling her. He's saying these things to really make her stop and think. She said, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So I believe that you are the Christ. Now, she runs back to get her sister. Mary is back at the house there, and she went back and told them, and Mary jumped up to run, and then the people who were in the house, they thought, well, Mary is going to the tomb to weep. Their culture was that when somebody died for a certain amount of days, you had people come in and wail and weep. Now the weeping wasn't the true kind of weeping and crying of where your heart is broken, but there were professional wailers, and they would hire out. So you'd go get somebody and say, would you come and wail my brother? So there would be then women that would come, and they would sit there for whatever days you paid them, and they would wail. Oh, 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 and they would just wail like that. Now, of course, people who were really hurt, they also wailed, but they cried. Their grief was a little bit different. So now, these people thought she's going to the tomb to weep. She's going there to try to get rid of her grief. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. They've obviously talked about this. They both concluded the same thing. If only Jesus had been here, why, he wouldn't have let him die. And so Jesus asked him, he said, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and he said, where have you laid him? So Jesus is inwardly troubled and groaning. They said to him, Lord, come and see. And here's your shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. It meant that he shed tears. It's not the kind of weeping that the wailing is, but he shed tears. Tears actually ran down his face. And the Jews, when they saw it, they said, see how he loved him? In other words, here's a man that's truly in grief and he's hurting. And some of them said, of course, I guess this is a logical question, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? So they're wrestling with it. Is Jesus the one doing these miracles? Couldn't he have kept him from dying? Well, you can ask the question, and I guess the answer is yes, but he didn't, and it doesn't prove anything. But still, these people are wrestling with that question. Well, Jesus now goes up to raise Lazarus. He came up and he says, take away the stone. Now, let's look at some tombs. Here's a tomb, and you see that they'd take the person inside this cave, then they'd roll that big stone that's been cut out, they'd roll it over the opening. They would leave the body in there for a year so that the body would decay, and the only thing left would be the bones. They'd go in and they'd get the bones, they would put them in a little box, a bone box, and then store them in some other place. That way they could reuse the cave as a tomb. But there is an actual one. Here's a slot of where the stone rolls back and forth. They would cut a slot so you could take that stone, you could roll it back and forth. There's the stone that is there that you can see. There's the hole to the cave right back of this guy, and there's a pretty big stone that's there. To give you an idea, you're looking down on the stone that's down there. So you can see these stones are pretty big. There it is in relationship to a guy that is sitting there. And so this stone, it would take 2 or 3, 4 people to even budge that stone in there. You roll the stone away, then you can go into a cave. This is a different cave than the one I showed you a minute ago. You go in there, and the first thing you see is Steve Grimes sitting there. See him in the middle? Now, this is a room of where people would go in before they would actually go back into the other rooms of where the tombs were. There it is. You get up, you walk into a little cubicle, and they have little cutouts where they would put the body, lay the body up there, and that's where the body would lay for that week that is there. There's actually a body up there the day we were in there. If you don't recognize me, recognize him, well, that's okay. Now, so here you have these tombs. Now, Martha, when he said, take away the stone, she said, Lord, by this time there is a stench. He stinketh, for he has been dead 4 days. Now, there's no question this man is dead. Jesus said, did I not say unto you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? So now we see what he's talking about. And they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes, and the first thing he did was pray to the Father. Father, I thank you that you've heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by said this, that they believe that you sent me. So, Father, I thank you, and I'm talking to you now to give you the glory so that they'll know that I'm asking you. I believe in you, but now they'll have to make a decision. If what they're getting ready to see, in other words, when they see this, how will they react? Will they believe that I am actually the Son of God? And when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! So now he's committed himself. He's yelled in the tomb, called him by name, and he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said unto him, loose him and let him go. There is a picture, an artist's conception of what he would look like. They had him all bound and wrapped like this, so he got up and he would obviously shuffle his feet and shuffle out, and there he is. They unwrapped him, let him go. Lazarus has raised from the dead. Now, if there's anything in this world that would convict these Jews that Jesus really is the Son of God, this had to be it. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. They said, we can't deny it anymore. He is the Christ, the Son of God. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Now here's his enemies. It didn't affect them. Even though they had seen beyond any shadow of a doubt he raised him from the dead, they ran back to the people trying to kill Jesus and said, this is what Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. They admitted it. Now people have always said, how would John have known they had admitted it? Well, keep this in mind. There were three people involved that we all know about. There was Nicodemus, who was a believer. He was in this council. There was Joseph of Arimathea, who was a believer. He was in this council. They were members of the Sanhedrin. And there was probably a guy who later became known as the Apostle Paul. He was a student of one of the great leaders in this council. So they obviously would have told, after this happened, here's what happened. Here's what we did. They would have had that information. So here was the conclusion. If we let him alone, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away our place and nation. We have to do something. If we let this guy alone, the Romans will come, they'll remove us from our office, they'll take away our nation, they'll say we can't handle the situation. So we need to do something. Now Caiaphas, who was the high priest, he said, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is, now this, you know nothing at all, do you consider, is really a little sharp gouge, and it can be one not as harsh as what you think, but it's to let people know there's only one option. Look, there's only one option. It would be like if Oliver and I are talking about a problem that maybe he has out there. I say, look, dummy, there's only, we know what's going to happen. There's a water pipe and it's leaking. And Oliver's saying, well, what can we do? Look, dummy, there's only one thing. Dig it up and fix it. There's no other option. That's what Caiaphas is saying. Caiaphas is saying, you don't know anything, nor do you consider it that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish. There's only one option. If we let this man go, our nation is going to be destroyed. So the only thing we can do is kill this man, because it's expedient that one man should die so that the nation can be saved. So it's just logical. The man must be killed. And they agreed. That is a logical thing. Now, of course, you and I know that there was one other conclusion they could have come to. They could have said, look, beyond any shadow of a doubt, this man is the Christ. Let us bow down to him. They could have done that. But no, they're not going to do that. It said, now this, he did not say in his own authority, but being a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. This is interesting. It gives God the glory for him saying this. He's a high priest, and he's prophesying. He's saying something that he doesn't know what he's saying. He doesn't understand the significance of it. It would be like two other cases that I know about in the Bible. You remember Balak, who went out to curse the Jews, and he was paid, and he went out, and he looked down, opened his mouth, and started to curse the Jews, and when the words came out, it blessed them. Blessed be these people. And he tried this 2 or 3 times. And when he'd opened his mouth, he couldn't curse them. The words would come out, and he would bless them. He didn't intend to. And of course, the other one was that donkey. That donkey didn't have the intelligence to say, Well, I believe that I will teach him a lesson and that I will do this. Caiaphas is just in the same situation. And so what he's saying is that God had him to say something that turned out to be true, that Jesus was going to die for the nation. Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. So there it is. Therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. So the Sanhedrin has now laid it down, and they've said he must die. We must kill the man in order to save the nation, because if we don't, we admit he's doing miracles, and he will certainly convert everybody, so we have to kill him. Well, at this time, Jesus now, remember, he's 2 miles west of Jerusalem. He now skirts around and goes up about 15 miles north of Jerusalem. There's a little town up there called Ephraim, and that's where he's staying, there at Ephraim. Now, he's going to stay there for a period of time. It said, and the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Then they sought Jesus and spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple, what do you think? Will he come to the feast? So you see, Jesus is the conversation piece that's taking place among the Jewish nation and among the Sanhedrin. Everything is about Jesus. Is he who he says he is? Will he come? What will he do? One man standing against the whole power of this nation. What do you think he'll do? Will he show up at this Passover? It said, now both the chief priest and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. So the law goes out. Anybody knows where Jesus is, you come to me and tell me. Because the decision has been made, we have to kill the man. That's where we will be in our next study, when Jesus goes back down to Jerusalem to see what happens. Okay, class dismissed.